Hi, this is Pat Johnson, your sociology instructor. In this mini lecture, we're going to talk about the concepts of ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. In an earlier lecture, we talked about multiculturalism versus assimilation. These were topics about what should happen when a person enters our society. Should they assimilate, in other words, melt into American society? Or should we believe in multiculturalism and allow that person to retain their own cultural values, behaviors, and language? The concepts of ethnocentrism and cultural relativism are similar, but they are looking at how we judge other cultures, other societies, whether or not that person is deciding to enter our society. If I hold an ethnocentric point of view, I'm looking at another culture through the eyes of my own culture. In other words, I'm judging another culture by my culture's standards. The cartoon that I've included for this PowerPoint slide has the obviously Western, possibly American woman looking at the woman from probably the Middle East and saying, everything's covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture. In other words, the American woman is saying what that woman is going through in her society is wrong. And that's an ethnocentric point of view because it's judging the woman from the Middle East by the standards of our own culture. On the other hand, if you look at the caption for the woman who is fully covered, she is saying, or she's thinking to herself, nothing covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture. In other words, she's looking at the American woman in the bikini through the value system of her own culture. She also has an ethnocentric point of view. On the other hand, if we use cultural relativism, we're judging a society by that society's own standards. In other words, is something working for that culture? So it's hard to be culturally relative because I have to, at least for a time being, try to break away from my own culture's value system and examine the cultural value or behavior that a person in another culture is engaged in and try to understand whether that behavior or that value system works for that person's culture, works for that person's society. Again, this can be difficult. In my seated classes, I have students look at the topic of sweatshops and particularly child labor. Now, in American culture in the 21st century, sweatshops and particularly child labor are considered wrong, illegal. It just shouldn't be done. Kids belong in school. They shouldn't be engaged in work. Well, that's a real ethnocentric point of view. Yes, it used to be part of our culture in the past, and my grandmother engaged in what would be called child labor because she had to help support her family, and she had to drop out of school in the 6th grade and start working in a factory. But in the second decade of the 21st century, we would just think that something like that is entirely wrong because it's not a part of our current American value system. That's an ethnocentric point of view. But let's look at it from the cultural relative point of view. In many societies, for the economic well-being, for the survival of the family, often people work in sweatshops. They earn much less, they work long hours, and sometimes their children also work in the garment factory. If we understand that It works for that culture, and it's a way that that culture advances economically. We are using cultural relativism. We're understanding that behavior from that culture's point of view. Now, I'm not saying that ethnocentrism is always right or cultural relativism is always right. Sometimes we have to look at it by a case-by-case basis. For example, with the topic of genital mutilation, where in some societies women's genitals are mutilated so that they will not feel sexual arousal during intercourse and therefore are less likely to engage in sexual behavior outside of marriage. I have an ethnocentric point of view. I just can't understand that or appreciate that behavior from that culture's point of view. On the other hand, I think education is good, not just in America, but for children in all societies. But I understand that in some societies, children are needed economically to work outside the home. And therefore, I somewhat have a culturally relative point of view for that topic. So these will be two terms that you'll expect to know. You'll expect to be able to write about and think about with various topics. Ethnocentrism, judging another culture by your culture's values, and cultural relativism, trying to understand that culture through its own society and its own values.